All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am so excited to dive into this topic with Shiayli again and to expand my own knowledge. Before we get started, though, I want to acknowledge that I am currently living and working and playing on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. I'm incredibly grateful to be on this land and to benefit from this land. I also want to encourage you to take some time to visit the Indian Residential School Survivor Society to educate yourself, to unlearn if necessary, to do some relearning, and if you have the means to donate and support that organization. And now I'm going to stop my screen share and I'm going to turn it over to Shiayli. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Yours.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm incredibly grateful and honored to be here talking to you and just sharing this space. When I'm presenting, when I'm working through these webinar notes and just prepping for this presentation, it always deepens my learning around this subject matter. And so hopefully in our conversation today, you have some takeaways too and are able to deepen your own learning and engagement with this topic. So just a brief introduction. As Amy said, my name is Shiayli. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm speaking to you as a settler on Treaty 6 territory, which is colonially known as Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Yes, I am in the prairies. I don't know why I moved back here, but I plan to return to Vancouver soon. And I just want to start by expressing gratitude, first of all, for Amy for organizing this amazing series. I had the pleasure of being coached by Amy when I was a player on the UBC women's hockey team. And she's become an invaluable mentor and resource of mine. And so I'm so honored to be here and joining her in her cause, which is the Women in Sports Speaker Series. So this was a platform she created really to promote gender equity and accessibility within sports, because as we know, that is still an issue that we are up against as female athletes, as females in sports, and something we want to work towards changing. And so, in acknowledging that we have this goal to move towards equity, it's also important to recognize that equity is inextricably linked to processes of settler colonialism. When we're trying to promote and create and access equity within our systems and within our institutions, we have to grapple with the fact that these are colonial institutions, these are colonial processes, and really what the ramifications and consequences of this are and how we each play a role. As we know, recently, we're all having to grapple with the reality of our ongoing colonial history across Turtle Island, an ongoing process that Indigenous peoples have been talking about, speaking out against, and surviving since contact, right? And so in acknowledging that I'm a settler on this land, I'm also acknowledging that I benefit from settler colonialism and access to this land. And so therefore, it's my unique responsibility to be accountable to that and to use my platform and my work to further our efforts towards decolonization and towards equity where all people are safe and included and represented. And so as we move forward today, I want you to reflect on your relationship to the land you are on and your positionality. Maybe you're Indigenous, but maybe you're a settler like myself. And we each have a unique relationship to the land, and so a unique role we play in how we go about making a unique impact and working towards equity. And so before we move into this presentation today, just channeling feminist ethics, I want to make sure that I credit my predecessors. So I would like to recognize that I have some amazing mentors at the UBC Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office. I worked there for 3 years as a student staff when I was in my undergrad, and they were my introduction to consent culture and consent culture education. So today, in moving through this webinar with you and talking about this work, a lot of the foundational theories and concepts and approaches I am presenting today are stuff I got from them. And so it's really important to credit our predecessors, because even the work at the office at SV Pro that we did and that we continue to do is grounded in an ongoing legacy of leadership and activism by like Black women, trans women, queer folk, and people of color. And if we don't acknowledge the people whose work and whose shoulders we're standing on and building off of, we are not acknowledging our power and our privilege in this system. So just a little introduction to how I got started into this work. So what brought me into social justice work was really wanting to make a difference in the world around me, in the systems, and on the people around me. And if you're a coach, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, or anyone who's embodying a leadership role, I'm sure that resonates with you and is similar to your own goals. And so what I also know that is true about most people is that most people identify as being good at heart. We usually have good intentions and we do care. Yet through my experience with social justice work and specifically with anti-violence work, and also just through my lived experience as a mixed race female, I see this discrepancy between the values and ideals we aspire to have and the ones we hold in our heart versus the ones we actually take action on. And so today I really want to address this difference between how we feel and what we intend to do versus what we actually do. And when you're experiencing the ugly side of violence or inequity, the need for change seems obvious. This is something I've experienced and others have experienced within sport, or just based on our gender or based on our race. And what's really painful is when we feel that it's obvious for us and it's necessary, but that good people aren't doing anything or aren't doing enough. And so understanding that there is the will to learn, there is the will to change, and there is the will to do good in the world, I really want to harness that and find a way to work through these barriers that are stopping us from taking effective action and leadership. So I'm going to do a quick screen share here so that you can see the agenda for this presentation. All right, there we go. Should be good to everyone. Okay, so I have to admit that after I posted the description for this talk, I had a complete change of heart and totally revamped this whole presentation. And I'm taking a new approach. And sometimes that's what it takes when we're talking about leadership. It's finding new and innovative ways to approach tired and exhausted situations. And so in this presentation, I'm not going to answer all of your questions. I'm not going to leave you knowing all of the things. Frankly, it's impossible to do that in 1 hour. If I do my job properly, I'm just going to leave you asking better questions and more nuanced ones. And the best leaders are the people who ask the best questions and who stay open to learning the answers. So I'm also not here to change your minds. As we know, stats and facts don't change people's minds. We're in 2021 now, and we have stats around climate change, around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, around the Truth and Reconciliation Report and their 94 calls to action. And yet we see a lot of inaction around these important issues. We know what we need to do. We know what the problems are. So what's stopping us? So in this hour, I'm coming in with another strategy. I'm here to appeal to your humanity, the sense that we all have in us about what is good and what is working. We each have an understanding of what safety feels like to us, what equity feels like to us. And as we move through this session today, I want to encourage you to keep returning to that inner knowing and that knowing of how to move in the world that doesn't need facts or stats or ethical or political frameworks in order for you to know what the right thing to do is. So today we're going to be talking about championing consent culture. And we'll be talking about why sexual violence is an intersectional issue. We know that anti-racism is a big topic today in our organizations and in our spaces, and we'll look at how that intersects with sexual violence. We'll also look at the role shame plays in shutting us down from learning, growth, and accountability, and also shutting us down from moving towards change where we can create systems that are more equitable. We'll also be redefining what it means to create safe spaces, and also looking at how we create, maintain, and dismantle culture on a daily basis. And then lastly, I'll be giving you some recommendations and next steps for you to follow up on your own, for you to deepen this work and bring it into your respective organizations and spaces. So what I want to talk about today is what blocks us from taking action. Now, instead of beginning with talking about what blocks us from achieving consent culture, I want to begin by addressing what blocks us from taking action and from feeling empathy and displaying empathy for ourselves and others. So today I want to talk about shame. So what is shame? I never really understood how shame functioned in my own life until I read this book by Brené Brown. And as Amy can attest to, Brené Brown is amazing. I reference her in everything now. So I would highly recommend getting this book if you have not read it. And she describes shame as this intensely painful feeling or belief that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And so you might think, well, that's great, but how does that relate to consent culture and anti-violence work? And I'll get into that. But one thing you need to know is that cultures in which shame is high have very detrimental effects to the people within them. It's correlated with high rates of addiction, of violence, depression, eating disorders, and bullying. All things that create spaces that are unsafe for ourselves and for others. So why shame? And how does it relate to consent culture? So during my time at university, I saw again and again the way shame popped up in my interactions. I didn't realize this until I read the book and looked back at my experiences in retrospectively. And I know a lot of us can relate to that. And I began to understand the way it actually played out in people's responses when I was advocating for consent culture education, when I was advocating for support for survivors or on behalf of myself. And I started to realize that people's inability to take action and deal with the magnitude of rape culture wasn't from a lack of understanding what the problem was or a lack of caring, but it was a feeling of being unequipped to handle the shame and the feelings of complicity that come up with that. So I saw it time and time again, the coach who felt shame that they didn't know about or hadn't clued into the presence of an abuser in our midst. The romantic partner who felt shame because their partner's experience of sexual violence registered as their own loss of control. The friends who felt shame due to their associations to people who caused harm. And lastly, the people who felt shame because they themselves had caused harm and their inability to take accountability for their actions because they saw no way to move through the feelings of crushing unworthiness and unlovability that come with reckoning with that. So shame manifests in many, many ways, but consistently results in the inability to hold space, respond with empathy, accept accountability, and move towards taking effective action. So we need to address shame in order to do better. So Brené talks about culture and shame and the way it creates environments toxic to vulnerability, connection, belonging, creativity, learning, growth, innovation, all of the good things that we want to foster on our teams, in our cultures. And these are all aspects that are important in maintaining a culture where consent is normalized. So let's take a look at how shame functions as a cultural tool. If you look at the structure of society that we live in today, we understand that we live in a patriarchy. So this is a system of male-dominated power structures, practices, and social norms that maintain a gendered stratification of power. And so a couple key aspects of patriarchy is that it's committed to the gender binary, the idea that there are two genders, male and female, and also that it is hierarchical. In other words, it's inequitable by nature. And so how are these aspects maintained? Through the cultural weaponization of shame. So let's take a look at some gender scripts within patriarchy. So for people who have been socialized masculine, they're shamed for displaying emotion. They're taught that their worth is tied to physical, sexual, and professional prowess. And they experience shame if they're unable to live up to these narrow standards of masculinity. On the other hand, people who have been socialized feminine are shamed for displaying physical or behavioral traits we have deemed masculine. They are taught that their value as women is tied to thinness, youthfulness, and our ability to be sexually desirable in a way that appeals to men and to the mass marketing industries. And we experience deep shame if we aren't able to achieve femininity to this standard. Not only do we have gender scripts within the patriarchy, but we also have sexual scripts. So let's think of the social messaging we hear around sex. People who are socialized masculine are taught that they are expected to want and enjoy sex at all times. And it's socially reinforced through shaming men who do not frequently or abundantly engage in sex. On the other hand, people who are socialized feminine are taught that respectable women don't want or enjoy sex, a belief that is also socially reinforced through shaming women who do not abstain or maintain a low frequency of sexual engagement. And so, as we can see, these scripts are just incredibly disempowering, and they actually set us up for failure. First of all, who are all of the men having sex with? But seriously, if we grow up with these confusing and contradicting messages, such as women not wanting or enjoying sex, how are we to react when a woman displays hesitancy or other indicators of non-consent? Or what about the way gender scripts really make sexual rejection for men be a trigger point of shame? How do we grapple with the fact that not all sexual advances are wanted or enjoyed by men, and that a lot of them identify as survivors? This is not to excuse people of the harm they cause, but it's to contextualize this harm within larger social scripts and patterns that normalize it. Furthermore, let's talk about the treatment of people who do not fit these patriarchal gender binaries. For feminine men and masculine women, they continue to be devalued and seen as less desirable in relation to traditional gender norms and beauty standards. And it also has devastating effects for people who are trans and non-binary and face inordinate amounts of social stigma, harassment, and violence. As we can see, these social norms that are governed and maintained through cultural shame as a tool of dominance and control, really sustains inequity. And inequity creates systems where we are more at risk of perpetuating harm. So let's get beyond the gender binary. We know how gender norms are reinforced and how they devalue people who sit outside the gender binary. But let's also get beyond gender altogether. Later, we'll be talking about why intersectionality is a very important factor when addressing consent culture. So let's talk about the fact that we also live in a rape culture. So this is a term that describes broader attitudes about gender and sex and sexuality that really function to normalize sexual misconduct and undermine equality. We've already talked about what some of these things are and how they produce systems in which harm is common. So here's a representation of how rape culture functions. So one of the factors that allows rape culture to flourish is the prevalence of everyday sexism, which is normalized and sustained through the patriarchy. and rigid gender norms and gender roles. So this example shows us that here on the bottom part of the triangle, we have statements and practices and behaviors that normalize inequity. As we move up the triangle, we see that the normalizations of attitudes and beliefs on the lower tiers, they actually excuse and enable actions represented on the layers above them, actions that continue to grow more harmful. Now, this demonstrates the way harmless and everyday, seemingly harmless and everyday interactions, they actually maintain and contribute to greater systems of inequity and harm. So the idea here isn't to consider whether you are personally on the rape culture pyramid or not. We're all represented here. Just by the fact that we live in a rape culture, a culture in which sexual violence is prevalent, we all show up here. So maybe you don't personally identify with having contributed to any of the actions on the bottom tier of the triangle, but we're all part of spaces and in groups and around people who do participate in those things. And so in those moments, we have a choice whether we validate that and normalize it, or whether we are going to be that presence that disrupts the normalization of these beliefs that contribute to inequity. And now this is not to make you feel personally responsible for the overt violence that's pictured at the top of the triangle, the violence that we traditionally understand as sexual violence. But it's just to understand how we are all part of creating and maintaining culture on a daily basis. And hopefully this empowers you to understand that you have a unique responsibility and an important role to play in creating safety and creating equity. So as you can see, the factors represented here, if you take a look at them, are pretty heavily gendered. Same as within the patriarchy. Patriarchy and rape culture function through gender scripts and gender norms. But we need to get beyond gender because, as we know, sexual violence isn't all about gender. Let's take a look at intersectionality. So in 1989, Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality. And this is an analytical framework that accounts for the ways multiple axes of oppression and privilege converge, causing each individual to experience oppression differently. And it's based on unique and intersecting factors of their multiple bases of identity. So on the side there, you can see them listed. And this is a non-exhaustive list, but these are factors that contribute to our relationship to power and privilege. Right? We understand that as women, the gender inequity we experience isn't all the same. It's different if we are white woman versus if we are a Black woman, if we are poor or if we are low income. There are so many factors that intersect to really create our unique experience to power and to privilege. More simply put, intersectionality is simply about how certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to good things or your exposure to the bad things in life. So why is sexual violence an intersectional issue? Understanding the relevance of intersectionality helps us understand the ways relationships to power function. And it's true that the majority of violence is perpetrated by cis men against women. But for Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals, it's even more disproportionate. And it's the same thing for women who are trans or people who are disabled. These facts demonstrate that while gender plays a role, so do a variety of other factors, and that our efforts to address sexual violence cannot be achieved without also engaging in anti-racism, decolonialism, and other anti-oppression work. So the need is further evident through the over-publicization of sexual assault cases in which Black men are the perpetrators and white women are the survivors. This is despite the fact that the large majority of sexual violence occurs between members of the same racial or ethnic groups. And so we can see here how stereotypes and norms around gender, around sex, around race, and a variety of other factors really commingle to create patterns of harm. So in addressing intersectionality, we're addressing power and how power is at play. It's a common misconception that sexual violence is an act fueled by passion, fueled by lust, or it just happens in the moment, you know? But the reality is, most sexual violence is premeditated, and it's actually an act that's all about power, dominance, and control. So when you look at the people who most frequently perpetrate violence and the people who are most frequently targeted by them, we see that sexual violence is most often perpetrated by people with relatively high amounts of power and privilege. And it's perpetrated against those who've been systemically oppressed and marginalized, and whose identities have been socially devalued and dehumanized within our society. So I have these images on the screen because Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals sustain disproportionate amounts of violence, as do disabled people. And age factors into disability as well, and as do trans people. These are identities that we have culturally devalued and dehumanized and seen as less than. And the way we are taught to value people ends up being the way we treat them. And abuses of power we get away with are ones that we feel enabled to keep engaging in. Jeff Bezos. Anyways, moving on. So, oh, I missed that slide. Okay. So let's talk about shame-based cultures. In a culture that's based in shame, which we can see play out in the patriarchy, how we use shame to control and maintain the status quo. And when our self-worth is on the line and tied to these rigid ideals, whether they're around masculinity or femininity and what it means to be a good woman, or what race is superior or valued within our society, our self-worth is on the line. And really, in cultures where shame is used as a tool of control and dominance, it really fosters disengagement, it fosters blame and gossip, and it also fosters stagnation and favoritism. And if you're a coach, you understand that these are all aspects that are toxic to your team cultures and toxic to individual well-being. And so it's in our best interest to steer clear of shame-based coaching and cultures that use shame as a means of motivation. And so on the other hand, cultivating worthiness looks like increasing creativity, increasing innovation, increasing courage and people's willingness to be vulnerable. Brene Brown describes vulnerability as our willingness to, vulnerability is risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. So when we have courage, we are being vulnerable. When we are taking leadership, we are being vulnerable, right? And we need safety to do that. And it also really breeds perseverance. And I don't know about you, but as an athlete, perseverance was something that was really necessary in my sport, but also in balancing my roles and responsibility in the sporting world with all the other ones I have as an individual. So before I get into shame-based reactions, I want to quickly talk about how frequent it is in sports that shame comes up. I mean, shame comes up everywhere, but shame-based coaching is actually quite common. And unfortunately, in the short term, it's actually quite effective, which is why people keep doing it. But it's not a good method because it might produce motivation or increased effort in the moment, but that motivation and effort is fear-based and quickly subsides and is replaced by the more long-term consequences, which is feelings of being trapped and powerless and isolated, lower self-esteem, predispositions to mental health and addiction. And so I really want to get around this. And I want to use a story of my own experience of interacting with a culture and with a team that was really heavy in its shame-based practices, and what that looked like when sexual violence occurred and how they responded to sexual violence in a culture like that. So, a little story for you all. I was once friends with a few guys on a male sports team, and it later came out that some of their teammates were sexual predators. They engaged in sexual activity non-consensually, and it was public knowledge. And the team was reeling, they didn't know what to do. And it was met with silence. Now, for myself and a lot of other women who'd previously interacted with these men in question, the news wasn't surprising. And we were left feeling really angry and saddened and grief stricken that men we considered friends, men we respected, failed to speak up about this or speak out and address it after the fact, after it became public knowledge. And so it really left survivors reeling in silence and really feeling like a lot of them were complicit through their inaction. So, as I mentioned before, perhaps the hardest part is not accepting that people do bad things, but that good people, the ones we trust, the ones we look up to, the ones we go for help, it's hard feeling that they are not doing anything. So I was really upset about this. I talked to some of my friends about it. I was like, oh man, like I've had so many conversations with these people. Like they know I'm in their corner. They know I advocate around this stuff. Like, why aren't they showing up right now? But then I reflected on some previous interactions I've had with them, on like some of the men on that team. And I'll give you some examples. So in the past, I'd had an athlete come to me and describe the way he was emotionally and verbally berated by his coach and how dehumanized he felt. And when I asked him if he considered having a conversation just to talk about alternative forms of communication and motivation that would work for him better, it was met with him saying, okay, I can't do that because if I talk about it, I will cry and I would rather die than let him see me cry. Now, this was the same team that a player came to me when they were looking for support, when they were struggling with depression and suicidality. And when I asked about other people that knew about it or that could also provide them with additional support, he admitted that his coach didn't believe in mental health or take it seriously. This is the same team that I later found out that guys who had stood up to these predators and some of their toxic and harmful behaviors earlier on had been ostracized by their peers and bullied because of it. And this is the same team that when their teammates were outed as sexual predators, people were silent and did nothing. And so the thing is, when we experience shame, we are also more likely to engage in shaming and criticizing others. And so even the men who did follow up with me later on after the fact to acknowledge that it had happened, they were quick to point the fingers at other people and make it their problem, instead of looking at how this inequity and harm is rooted in their culture and in their everyday interactions. So I can't say who all participated in predatory behavior on that team, but I also know that a lot of men on that team cheated on their romantic partners. And this is another form of non-consensual action, and one that's also linked to feelings of powerlessness and low self-worth. And as we can see through their interactions with their coach and how they're being treated and how they felt, this was an issue far earlier, like even way before anything was physically unsafe for other people, right? So let's talk about some common shame-based reactions when addressing sexual violence or inequity. Maybe it's racism, maybe it's sexism. One of them is defensiveness. So this sounds like making the moment about that their intentions, feelings, and image rather than focusing on the impact they've had. When you confront someone about something, when you call them in, when you talk about harms and impacts, if they get defensive and make it about them, there's usually an underlying shame story. The story might be, I'm scared I'm being called a bad person and want to make sure people know I'm not a bad person. Because at the root, shame is this feeling that we are bad and therefore unworthy of love and connection and belonging. Another reaction that is shame-based would be to distance and dismiss. This looks like not taking accountability for harm or our role in it, deciding that it's actually not our role or responsibility to address it or help fix the problem. And the shame-based story here is that, ooh, shame is coming up for me and it's uncomfortable. So I'm going to avoid it by convincing myself that it's not mine. Another one is projecting blame and criticism. This looks like focusing on how someone else was wrong or bad, how someone else was toxic or harmful. And really the shame story here is the feeling that, oh, shame is making me want to blame someone and make them wrong so I can avoid responsibility and feel secure and safe in being right. Another reaction that was common when I talked to people about sexual violence or advocated for consent culture or told them about harms that had occurred was that they were quick to defend the people who committed that harm by minimizing or making excuses. And so this sounds like statements of good faith that really dismiss the magnitude of harm. They say, oh, they didn't mean that, or, like, it's probably because of this or because of that. It's not as harmful, like it's not as big as a problem as you think, right? And it's like they do this to minimize harmful intent, but minimizing harmful intent does not minimize impact. And so really the shame-based story here is saying, I see myself implicated in this situation and I don't believe I'm a bad person. I can't believe I'm a bad person because shame, so you must be wrong. And I can't accept that this has caused so much harm because I don't want to have caused this much harm. It also looks like denying and disproving. Unfortunately, when survivors come forward, they still struggle with being believed because people don't want to believe them. It's painful to believe them. Oftentimes, people who have hurt us are people we know and have at some time respected and trusted, right? And so what denying, disproving sounds like is really struggling or refusing to believe a person when they say that someone has caused harm against them and attempting to deny or disprove this. And unfortunately, I myself as a survivor have experienced this and so have others. And really what the shame-based story here is saying that, oh my gosh, this incident hits so close to home and believing you will make me wrong. So you must be wrong instead. Like, you're a liar, I don't believe you, right? And this is so detrimental for survivors who are coming forward and seeking help, or for people who've experienced abuse or inequality who are coming forward for justice and support. And then another one, and this is one that is quite common, and I think we can all relate to this, is just straight up avoidance. Whether it was leaving my university papers till last minute because I didn't know what to write about, or I just didn't feel like doing them. Avoidance is it really sounds like feeling responsible or implicated in something, but not taking any action and avoiding the person who is harmed, in fact. Oftentimes when survivors come forward, they are met with feelings of isolation and people don't want to engage with them, frankly, because feelings of shame come up and they don't know what to do. And this is when we're deep, deep in our shame spiral. And this is when we keep ignoring emails, keep screening calls, avoid running into that person in public. And this really shuts us down from accountability. It shuts us down from growth and change and taking effective leadership to address culture. So understanding that shame comes up so often when we're addressing inequity and addressing cultures that enable harm and instances where harm has occurred, let's talk about cultivating shame resilience. So Brene breaks it down into 4 steps. First, we have to be able to recognize, name, and understand our shame. Where is it coming from? Maybe it's feelings of inadequacy and not enoughness that are based in beliefs we've internalized around gender, around sex, around race. And then also developing critical awareness about our own shame webs and triggers, right? When we feel shame, we run away from things. We don't deal with them properly. It shuts us off from learning and accountability and growth. And it also makes us more prone to using shame and blame and criticism against others, which only perpetuates the problem. So a way you could do this is step number 3, or a way you could combat this is by taking step number 3, which is to reach out to others, because shame doesn't want to be spoken about. Shame functions through silence, which we see in the example I used of the sports team. When something happened, people felt implicated, they felt shame, and so they stayed in silence and isolation instead of reaching out, connecting, getting support, learning, and growing. And when we reach out to others, we're able to connect through empathy, that feeling of connection and belonging, of being seen and being heard. And that really helps us strip away the layers of shame that encase us and keep us shut down. So having the ability to speak about our experience of shame with people, we'll speak about them with people who've earned the right to hear them. This is important, that when you're speaking about your shame, you go to people who you trust, who you've built relationships with, where you know there is a safe space and where they'll respond with empathy. Because when we share our shame, we are making ourselves vulnerable, and we need someone who can respond with empathy and to cultivate and create that sense of safety around us. So now, while it's important to address shame on the individual level and how it shows up for ourselves, what about addressing our cultures and our spaces? These might be some important steps and tools that you can share with others to help them navigate their own shame. But it doesn't do much to work on our shame individually if we're still steeped in cultures where shame is weaponized against us and where we feel unsafe to even show up and do this work in the first place. So let's talk about what a safe space is. So to me, a safe space is kind of like this ambiguous term. It's one of those feel-good phrases like equity, diversity, and inclusion. But let's break it down. What does that actually mean? And what does that look like in action? So when it comes down to it, we all understand what it feels like to be safe. If you just check in with your body, you know the ease and the calmness you have inside when you feel safe. You know how you tense up or are on edge or feel anxiety when you don't. And we all understand what safety feels like in our social interactions, the way we talk to each other, the way we act around each other. And so when talking about safe spaces, there's often this assumption that we're talking about physical safety, a space in which people don't experience physical abuse or harm. But what about emotional and mental safety and well-being? As we know, my example I gave about the male sports team, that space and that culture was toxic and harmful long before any physical abuse or sexual abuse was involved. And so when we're talking about safe spaces, we need to redefine it. This is a space where people's self-esteem, their integrity, and their personal bodily autonomy is respected. And this is a place where equity, respect, and consent is normalized within day-to-day interactions. So let's take a look at what safety looks like in action. So really, in a safe space, it's one in which people feel humanized. Their needs and their feelings are taken into account, they're validated and respected, and a space where they can act with integrity without facing humiliation or harassment or social embarrassment. And it's also where there is equity in the treatment of all identities. So the first one is respecting gender identity and gender expression. So an example of this would be referring to people using their pronouns, the ones they want to use, respecting their clothing preferences, their choice of jewelry, their style of nails or hair. Those are personal choices that are in their wheelhouse and they're not for us to make comment on. Respecting body image and bodily autonomy. So this looks like referring to someone's body in strictly anatomical terms related to performance, if we are a coach, if we are a trainer, and not in regards to size, shape, weight, or appearance. As we know, these things are tied to shame and our ideas around our lovability and value, especially for women. And it also means asking for consent before engaging in instructive physical touch or contact. Often we feel like we can be very hands-on with people, but it's their body, it's their choice, and we have to respect that. It also means respecting cultural integrity. So people's ability to engage in one's cultural food, their language, holidays, traditions, and their clothing and jewelry without fear of judgment or punishment or criticism. It also means respecting religious and spiritual integrity. So our ability to conduct ourselves in alignment with our values and our spiritual beliefs, and really observe any practices or traditions that we need to and want to without judgment or criticism or embarrassment. And finally, respecting people's health choices. So this could look like the autonomy to make choices that concerns to food. So maybe their food restrictions, maybe their supplements. Also medication, that is a personal choice. Birth control, I have to say that because of what's happening with the Olympics. These are all factors that are at an individual's discretion. And when I say to respect these factors, I'm talking about not making comments or jokes about them, even if these things are done in a positive way or in a complimentary way. Regardless of intent, when we do those things, when we make comments, these are microaggressions that really function to denormalize certain identities or traits by making them noteworthy or the butt end of a joke, even if it's well-intentioned, right? And so despite our good intentions, these aren't always complimentary and can actually contribute to people feeling low self-esteem or lacking safety. And we may not mean it this way, but depending on a person's identity and their experience, these are all factors that cultivate safety for them. And so we want to be really respectful. And a good rule of thumb is to just act professionally and engage and communicate in ways that are directly tied to your job description, and the goals you are achieving together, the goals you have agreed upon. And so now that we've defined what safety is, let's redefine what it means to be at risk. Now, traditionally, we've used the term at risk it's kind of like synonymous with vulnerability, and not in the courageous way that Brene talks about vulnerability, but we socially ascribe it to populations or people who, are experiencing abuse or violence or inequity at higher rates. And so this often comes with a lot of victim blaming messages or statements about how people who experience violence or harm, what they should or need to do to keep themselves safe. And it really puts the onus on them instead of the perpetrators who are causing the harm in the first place. So when I redefine at risk, I want to flip the script and talk about things that make us at risk of perpetuating harm. So now the CAC has a safe sport training for coaches, and in it, it talks about how abuse of power leads to maltreatment. And we understand how power and our relationships to power are mediated by intersectional factors of our identity. how they play out in culture through the hierarchies in our social norms, and also how they pertain to sexual violence and other forms of harm. So you are at risk of perpetrating harm when you're in systems and spaces where power differences are really prominent and unaccounted for. So we often have power differences embedded in formal roles, like professor to student, coach to athlete, boss to employee. And as we understand, in these roles, when there is a big difference between power, there is no basis for consent. But we're not just talking about sexual consent. We're talking about consent in everyday interactions, how that shows up. So for example, this might be like asking people for things, right? If you're a coach, you might ask an athlete to take on additional responsibility or do you a favor. And it's seemingly harmless. You care about them, you believe in them, right? You have a good relationship. But can that athlete actually safely say no? Maybe they can, but it's always mediated by power and the fact that you have more power than them. And so we really have to navigate consent carefully. An example would be unpaid physical and emotional labor. This happens all too often with players, with coaches, especially if you are a female in this game. I've been a part of too many spaces where females in sports are asked to take on unpaid physical and emotional labor for their organizations and teams. And it also involves uncredited expertise, which is a form of appropriation and exploration. When we go to racialized individuals and ask for help around equity, diversity and inclusion, and we don't pay them, or we don't give them a role that they can put on their resume. And then we take and use that knowledge for our own purposes. That is a form of appropriation and exploitation, right? And this may occur in very seemingly harmless day-to-day interactions in formal roles where there is respect, there is trust, but there is a power difference that is not accounted for. So now, as we know with intersectionality, power differences are also embedded in systems and structures and identities that aren't just job descriptions, aren't just our 9 to 5. They are consistent across the board. And so what this means is that they also inevitably affect dynamics within formal relationships. So, if you're a coach and you have a relationship with an athlete, there's already a power discrepancy. It changes if you're a white male and they're a Black female, right? That's just an example of how intersecting forms of oppression based on our identity really play into our relationships with power. And so what this means is that these interactions and ensuring that consent and equity is maintained in these interactions has nothing to do with your personal feelings and beliefs. You might not be sexist, you might not be racist, you might actually really trust and believe in them and respect them. But given their identity and given the power difference, there is no basis for consent. And so oftentimes you can end up putting more pressure on them, giving them more responsibility, things that they are unable to stand up to or say no to, because they also want to keep you happy. They want to keep that relationship going in a positive way. And it's also influenced by their past experiences. You don't know what people are bringing to the table, what traumas they've had in the past. And so this is just a reminder that you're responsible for your impact regardless of your intention. So as we know with safety and cultivating safe spaces, and when we look at the rape culture triangle, we see how everyday norms and interactions really perpetuate larger forms of harm, right? So I just want to reiterate that you might have close connections with your athletes or people that are under your power and under your care. And we have to make sure we're acting in ways that contribute to equity. Because we really have to grapple with this idea that it's not about us being good people. From what we learned from Amy's talk on value-based leadership, good is a value that isn't really actionable. Like, what does that look like in action? We have so much shame around whether we are good people or not. But what we should be looking at is being equitable people. And that can be broken down. That has tangible steps and behaviors and things we can do that actually create spaces in which harm is less likely to occur. And so I just want to leave you with some next steps, some recommendations of what you can do in your individual spheres of influence to really begin to deepen your work and your understanding of how inequity contributes to racism, rape culture, all of these things that we're trying to change. So first of all, on the individual level, I want you to visit and understand your shame triggers. If we're not doing the work, we have no hope of changing the culture around us, because we know that if we have parts of ourselves that are unmet and unaddressed, when we become unconscious or have moments where we lapse in our ability to maintain, to be present, we will perpetuate harm unintentionally, inequity unintentionally. We might contribute to shaming and blaming and criticizing. And so becoming aware of where you're inclined to use shame is the first place to start, and really create empathy for yourself. It begins with yourself, and then by extension, moves into how you treat others. And also, let's learn to unpack these social scripts and biases we've internalized, whether it's around gender, race, or sex. Given the society we live in, the social norms and messages that have been taught to us, we all have these internalized biases. And that doesn't make us bad people. It just means we have work to do. And we also have potential in being able to step up and make change. So at the organizational level, let's connect and collaborate with our local organizations and resources. I know for myself, I worked at the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office at UBC. And during my time there, we weren't able to form a collaboration with athletics around sexual violence and consent culture education. And we're a really well-resourced office, and we have people who want to do the work and contribute to building systems of greater equity. And so I encourage you to seek out what those resources and organizations are within your spheres. Maybe you're at a university, maybe you have resources through your work or through your business. And also seek to fill knowledge gaps by seeking out expertise. And make sure you pay the experts you are hiring. Oftentimes, people with racialized and marginalized identities are expected to do a lot of work, extra work, emotional labor, because they hold experiences and knowledge that is specific to where we need to go and what we need to do. And we have to ensure that we use our power and privilege responsibly and don't put more of a burden onto these people who are already living and experiencing the systemic effects of inequality. And so again, advocating for women in sports, make sure you are paying your women. Oftentimes women on teams and in organizations have to do extra emotional labor, not only just to show up in the same spaces that men do and be okay and function in ways that our value is, in ways that we are seen as valuable, but also we silently fill these gaps of knowledge and gaps of awareness because other people haven't been doing the work to address them and fill them themselves. So if you are in a position where you can do that, I highly recommend that you do. And this is a suggestion that I talked to Amy about. Actually, she was the one who introduced it to me, which is advocating to establish like an independent third-party reporting mechanism to ensure safety in sport. So as we know, with the example I gave of the male sports team, that was a very toxic culture. that was unsafe for its athletes' mental, emotional well-being. And it resulted in a culture that perpetuated harm, right? And unfortunately, if we don't have an independent mechanism, oftentimes these issues don't get addressed. I know we have feedback forms and coaching evaluation that we submit to the department every year. But coaches get to read that feedback. And oftentimes, based on the feedback, they can narrow down what athlete it is, who said it. And it just doesn't provide this sense of safety to be able to address issues. And the same thing if it's not a third party, right? If I go to the department who knows the coaches, who hired them, who has good relationships with them, me bringing up information or feelings or issues isn't going to be handled the same way if it's a third party. So if you have the ability to advocate for a mechanism like this within your organization, I would recommend that you do that. And then lastly, addressing structural, did I lose it? Addressing structural issues. So this could look like advocating at the youth sports level for policy, right? We need a mandate that we have compulsory education for administrators, for coaches, for athletes regarding anti-racism, regarding consent culture, regarding decolonization. These are often processes that are very slow at coming about and take so much activism, and we can really expedite this process if we can come from the top down and get our sports governing bodies on board to mandate some of these things. And that also means addressing hiring practices and employee retention. It's not enough to get diversity in the door. There has to be equity within these systems and structures of support that ensure that employees are safe in their environments and that they are able to stay and function and flourish in those environments. And same with athletes. We also have to establish and maintain safe sport mechanisms and trainings. So the CAC has one, we're moving in that direction. And also address class inequity and systemic barriers to participation. You know, it's really expensive to participate in sports sometimes, and even more so if you get to the university level or try to go professionally. These aren't always options for people. And so when we're looking at equity, when we're looking at inclusion, we also have to be understanding that money plays a big factor in people's ability to come into these spaces, stay in these spaces, and pursue greater dreams of oops, sorry. Okay, I think we cut out for a little bit there. Okay, so that concludes my presentation for today. I was super nervous coming in here and doing this because this is all new content. So this was definitely not as well rehearsed as previous webinars I've done. And so I really appreciate you just taking a chance with me and spending this time learning and growing together. I know it was very challenging for me to put this workshop together, and I really deepened my learning and my growing on this topic, and also on confronting my own shame and my own feelings of inadequacy and whether I'd be effective in this work. And so I just thank you for sharing this time with me, allowing me to have this platform. And I'll just leave it open to any questions that you may have. And also I encourage you to connect with me if you want to. I'm welcoming any feedback, comments, questions. I'm always happy to engage in further dialogue around this.
That was so amazing. Thank you. I had some very, I had one major aha moment, and I actually want to talk to you about it because we all know that the sexual scripts around the patriarchy are detrimental, or we all should know they're detrimental to both genders, or all genders, the whole binary. But the one thing that really got me was when you talked about the idea how women shouldn't like sex and how that actually plays a role in consent culture, and that link between if we raise our males to think, or anyone to think, that women shouldn't want sex, when a woman denies sex, they may not actually take that cue as a no. And it was just such a aha moment for me, because I think the stats are, it's like 1 in 4 collegiate students in the United States experiences sexual misconduct in some form. And so much of that is attributed to misreading cues and or not honoring themselves. And I think that just really plays into that sense of the sexual scripts. So
Yeah, for sure. Like this issue is inextricable from the norms we have around gender and sex and the roles that plays in society. And so that should just really motivate people to kind of start unlearning some of these biases and beliefs, right? Because we do see whether it's um, around activism, taking action, contributing to systems of equality. Like a lot of people have good intentions. They want to do the right thing. But if we're operating from these unconscious and internalized beliefs that are already inequitable, like we're starting behind the starting line, like we're not going to make it in this race. We need to start really by picking apart what are those things that are contributing to inequality. And like, yeah, I just hope it encourages people to do further and deeper learning.
yes, very much so. I think there is so much learning, and I would more unlearning, I think, than anything.
So much unlearning. Yeah.
The other point that I thought was really pertinent is the link between psychological safety and creativity, and that is such an important part in sport. I also partook in another talk where they looked at like error feedback and how we give error feedback, and how if it's not psychologically safe feedback, then it reduces your creativity. And I think it it comes into that shame. If I shame you, you're not going to try. Like, you don't want to be creative. Like, oh, so
Yeah, for sure. What we actually know from like science, neuroscience, and like physiology is that in the body, our physiological reaction to shame is very similar to the one in how we react to trauma. And we know that with trauma, that's like a survival mechanism part of the brain that we don't choose, right? We get stuck in fight, flight, freeze, these survival responses that are meant to keep us safe. Our bodies are flooded with different hormones, And so it's wild to me that shame functions the same way. And when we're talking about shame, it's like such a social construct. It happens between people, it happens with people. But what we don't realize is it actually arrests our body. It actually arrests our mind and our ability to process information, to respond to information. And so, yeah, like one of the things that I kept coming up against when I went and talked to people about sexual violence or harm, whether it's receiving support or advocating for change, was they would shut down on me. Like I could see their eyes glaze over. I could see their body language change. They would look away. And like, not only did that raise shame in me, where as a woman and as a survivor, I didn't feel seen and I didn't feel heard, but it also didn't present a space in which we could make any progress. So yeah, and hopefully just understanding the physiology of shame, that also helps us lower our shoulders and feel less shame about the shame.
which it's so true, because I think anytime we confront someone about consent culture, about racism, about those things, there is that instant flush of I am bad, right? And until
Yeah.
we can decenter ourselves and actually have the conversation about the issue at hand, the shame will continue to come. So,
Yeah.
and we get stuck.
Yeah. That's why we need those shame resilience skills.
Yes.
Because yeah, shame is so common. It pops up all the time. It will continue to. And so it's just about learning to navigate it and pick it out and not continue to perpetuate harm or inaction from those places.
Yes. And I think just normalizing that we all feel it. Like, we
Yeah.
all have that response.
Yeah.
And it's
Really connecting with others and talking about it. helps strip away the shame, for sure, normalizing
Shame.
it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. We've got 2 more talks tomorrow, so I hope people will join us for our final day. And please go visit the Indian Residential School Survivor Society.
Thanks, everyone.